Welcome back to our guide on importing a character into Super Smash Bros. 64. Today we're going to focus on textures. What are textures? Textures are the images we use to add detail to our character models. We looked at them a little briefly before when we were looking at getting our model ready for rigging, and today we're going to spend a lot of time just focusing on textures in general. So first things first, let's take a look. If we look here at textures for Ness, you can see here in general Ness has about 28 textures associated with him. This has to do with recolors, it has to do with facial change animations, and then it also has to do with his skeleton model. So all what we need to remember is that when it comes to characters and their textures, we're going to have a large amount. Part of this has to do with paletting, part of this has to do with texture swapping, but in general it's going to be a large amount. Given we see Ness and his different variety of textures, he has about 5 or 6 colors, I would say. I'm only going to stick with 4, and that's what we're going to end up developing. When we think about textures, there's a few things we have to consider. 1. Textures are of a specific size. If we look here, you can see on my little graph, textures are going to be 8 by 8, 8 by 16, 16 by 8, 16 by 16, and so forth, up to potentially 64 by 64. Super Smash Bros. 64 has a texture cache where it's going to read in the textures that will be then applied to the models. The larger your textures, the more space they take up in this cache, and the more likely you're going to see adverse effects. So one of the things we need to consider is keeping our textures as small as possible. For Brian, what we're going to do is we're going to modify this 103 by 103 texture. I'm going to be doing this modification inside of GIMP. You can use any image editing software you want, but please keep some of the principles in mind. Here is Brian's texture. If we see here, Brian has many different smaller textures that are applied to the model. We have his face, we have a texture for his staff, his cape, looks like there's a texture for his body, his shoes, and his arms, and his hair. All these textures were combined together on the model that I have. We need to break them apart into small BMP files. First things first, let's take a look at the face. If I use my selection tool here, I can highlight it. If I click here, as you can see in the bottom corner, it says rectangle is 64 by 32. That's the size of this section. They're sizes of 8. That's actually not too bad. So if I go here and I do crop to selection, that signifies just this section. But if we remember correctly, one of the things we're trying to do is limit the amount of textures that are present. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to highlight this texture and I'm going to put it down. Let's see here. We'll make this a new layer. Let's do the ear as well. Highlight you, put you at a new layer. There we go. So now I can move these around. We'll put the ear here at the bottom, and we'll put this piece above that. Then, if I highlight, oh, we're off a little bit on the corner. Let's drag this around. That right there is 32 by 32. I think that's pretty good. Let's crop to selection. Let's rotate our image. Image transform. I'm going to rotate it around by 180 degrees. There. That looks pretty good. I think we'll use this as our image. So, once we have our texture in mind, what we want to do is we want to go to Image, Mode, and Index. And you want to select 16 colors. If you take a look at the image closely, you might not notice much of a difference. If I hit Control Z, you see how it's very fuzzy to begin with? Well, when we index it, a lot of that fuzziness goes away. Why is that? Well, the original image was in mode RGB, which is any number of colors available. Technically all the colors you can think of. But when we index it, we're limiting it only to 16 colors. If you want to see proof of that, go to Windows. You want to go to your toolbox or your dockable dialogues. And in there, you will see color map. Click on color map and that brings up this. These are all the colors that this image contains. And you can make changes to them. For example, if I wanted to change the skin color here, I can change it. Why are we doing this? Well, Super Smash Bros. 64 requires all images to be 16-bit colors, and it requires it to be a BMP file. Let's export this image now. Export as. We're going to, let's say this is Brian, face, neutral, N-U-T, and we're going to say 1, BMP, and we export. No alpha channel, export it. Good. So that's our image. Then we want to repeat this process for most of the other textures. We're going to go in, we're going to find them, we're going to make them match our specific size. Again, 8x8, 16x16, and so forth. We're going to make sure we index the colors to 16, and we're going to export it as a BMP. If we repeat this process, we're going to end up seeing many different BMP files that used to represent the one main image. That's good. If we go into our model, now that we've created all these extra images, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to highlight the model, find a texture, and create it. If you have one texture or you're creating new textures, what we can do is we can click the little plus sign. If you click new, go in here, drop the specular down to 0 because it makes it all shiny and metally. Go to bit color. We're doing an image texture. Find your image texture, click open, navigate to the location of said image texture, and since we're doing the face, let's do Brian's face. And then we want to assign our tries to said texture. I'm going to highlight all these tries that I believe need to go there. And once you've done that, you just assign them and they pop up. And then you can move them around as needed. If I decide that I think his face is too large, I can shrink it or make it bigger. But that is how we assign our BMP textures to the model. And we're going to want to repeat that for the entirety of the model. Let's look at palettes a little bit. If I load up the Brian Quest 64 image again, right here, I know for a fact that blue is one of his predominant colors. This right here is a 16x16, perfect. Image, crop to selection, let's rotate it around. There we go. I don't think there's much else I need to do about that. Let's go to image, mode, index it. As you can see here, this is the variable amount of blues, and then all we need to do is export it. Export as, we'll call this Quest 64 cloth. Since it's a BMP file, okay, export there. When it comes to Super Smash Bros. 64, the way it works with alternate colors is it's taking the paletted color textures and replacing each individual location in the palette with the new color. That means it takes this blue and it's going to replace it with whatever it finds on the new paletted image. This can be very confusing if done incorrectly, because a lot of times what people will think is they will take said image as a PNG and then they'll just convert it many times over. They'll re-index, re-index, re-index. So you'll have 4 or 5 colors, but they're all indexed with the incorrect palette. When you import them into Smash Brothers, then you're going to start seeing really odd, disjarring colors. Things are not going to map up, they're not going to overlap correctly, and it's going to look awful. When you are creating your alternate colors, you have to go in and modify the color map. You have to change the palette itself. If I want Brian to have a red alt, I need to create his blue textures and then go in and modify each individual color so that it will be red as such. This will save you a lot of headache in the long run. This is the best way to do it. So this is what I recommend. Create your standard color images, create your textures, the BMPs, have them all indexed correctly, and then after that, go in and create your palettes. And there. That is Brian's red cloth. I'm going to export this now as _red. Okay, export it. I do want to bring up some information about the naming scheme as well. When it comes to the names itself, you're going to want to call them whatever the texture color is, _C, _color. I'm not sure how much the _C is needed. I do it based off of the fact that it's given me the most streamlined, successful results. But when it comes to importing the characters, you want to make sure that each texture is defined correctly, and you want to make sure that you follow the same nomenclature. The reason why I bring this up is that while we're dealing with the faces, such as, let's take a face texture. If we want to make Brian's hurt face image, well, what we need to do is we need to take one of his colors. Let's see here. I have to do it line by line, unfortunately. And while that can be a pain in the neck, again, in the long run, this is going to work out. There is a way you can sort of get away with some of the texturing issues. Like this, is if you create all of your textures at the same time and then index the entire image as one individual image, then you can have the palette shared amongst all of the textures. So that is one way to do it. But that doesn't really work with recolors. It kind of has to work with the same palette, because you remember you're sharing 16 colors amongst all the images. So if I do that for Brian, let's make our tool a little larger. Let's go up to about 12. Yeah, that works. And since it's just this hurt image, we're rushing into it. There we go. File, export this as Brian face _hurt. Export. There we go. So now we've done that. We now have his two images with the same palette. Again, you have to share palettes. One note I do want to make, when it comes to the face itself, even though it says Brian face hurt, do not put an _C in any of the images you're expecting to change. Like based off of the animations. The main reason why is because when I've done this in the past, it imported the textures assuming it was a color because of the _C, and that caused some form of weird artifacting on the actual face image that was imported. So it's important to note, while you are creating your hurt or idle animation textures, always avoid the _C. Another thing to also note is you are limited to the animation channels that exist in the current characters unless you are doing coding. Eventually we will be adding in more animations for Brian as we go, because we will get to a coding point. But given that we're just doing Brian over Ness at the moment, what's going to happen is we're going to be limited to what's available. We'll again look at what Ness has. He has a blink, and then he has his pained expression. Those are the only animations I can replace. So for now, I'm just going to be replacing his pained expression with him getting hit. That way we can see it happen. Once we have done that, you will have all of your BMP textures created. Then we can move on to rigging.